Hi.
Thank you for joining us today.
Can you, just 1 second, it's a technical question. Get rid of this.
We can try. I don't think it bothers me. It's just because. Hold on.
Yeah.
It's again, no.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us. It's very much appreciated. If you'd like to just begin, that would be fantastic. Thanks very much.
To start off?
Thank you.
Okay. So I'd like to say a couple of words about Edward Snowden and what people are doing regarding his work activity. I see somebody doesn't like it. Snowden is fated to live the rest of his life run or maybe in prison, less than delicate conditions. But that's true if we can take seriously these statements by U.S. government officials who have threatened to follow this miserable traitor who dared to tell the public what the government's doing to its citizens in the world, to follow him at the end of the earth, to apprehend him and punish him for these misdeeds. And there are many people who take it seriously, including, for example, the governments of Europe. They take the warning very seriously, as we saw recently with the disgraceful episode of the official plane of the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, who's flying from Russia back to Bolivia, and European governments, trembling in fear of the master, refused to allow his plane even to enter their airspace. And what did land finally, with technical problems in Vienna, security forces were sent in to search it. Gross violation of elementary diplomatic protocol, but when the master commands, the subjects obey. Not all, of course. Latin American countries bitterly protested, but after all, who are they? Actually, Latin America is probably the only place, or maybe the only place on Earth where Snowden could be relatively safe if he could possibly get there. Now, that's a dramatic historical reversal. South America in the past decade has broken pretty much free from Western domination. The last century or more, that means U.S. domination. That's the first time in 500 years since the Spanish and Portuguese explorers landed. It's now one of the few regions of the world relatively safe from U.S. intervention and punishment. And that showed up in the case of the capitulation of the European governments to Washington's threats in the Snowden case, but in other cases too. So recently there was a study, Open Society Forum came out with a study of rendition. And rendition, as you know, is maybe one of the most grotesque forms of torture, where you capture somebody who you don't like and send him off to some murderous, brutal dictatorship for him to be tortured. So that maybe you can extract some information from it. That's rendition, extraordinary rendition. And the study had to do with which countries participated in it. Well, most of Europe participated. The Middle East, of course, that's where they were sent to be tortured, in Syria, and Egypt, and the Mubarak, and so on. In fact, most of the rest of the world. But there was one region of the world that refused to participate in U.S.-run extraordinary torture, namely South America. And that's remarkable, in fact, doubly remarkable, for one reason, because until quite recently, 15 years ago, South America altogether was considered the backyard. What we tell them, you don't have to worry about it. And now they don't. The other reason why it's remarkable, which doesn't get discussed, of course, is that during the period when Latin America was under U.S. control and domination. It was one of the world centers of torture. Not by accident. There's a relation between those facts. Well, that changed, which shows that things can change. Actually, the prospects for Edward Snowden may not be entirely bleak. One reason is that popular sport for him is substantial, growing all over the world. That's one reason why his election for Rector at Glasgow is so significant. It's imaginable that it might even shame the government into some action, although at the moment it's not clear which government, that it can inspire similar actions elsewhere. Another positive sign is that the editors of the New York Times, surprisingly to me, they called for amnesty for Snowden. That's a welcome step, but it still falls far short of what should be done. Amnesty is for crimes. It's not for meritorious actions, highly meritorious actions in this case. Snowden was actually carrying out the highest duty of a participant in a democratic society, namely revealing to citizens what their elected representatives are doing to them and doing to others. Now, the government, of course, claims that citizens don't have a right to know. The governments have a right to keep what they're doing secret. And the reason that's given for that is security. There's a number of reasons to be skeptical about that reason. That justification. One reason is that it's reflexive. Almost whenever a government is caught doing something it shouldn't be doing, the immediate plea is security. Since the excuse is predictable, it carries no information, even in the technical sense, so it can be disregarded and it doesn't amount to anything. Nevertheless, it's worth looking into it to ask, well, what kind of security is really being achieved by this massive surveillance program. And when Snowden's revelations were released, General Keith Alexander, head of the NSA, said that 54 terrorist actions were prevented by the NSA surveillance campaign. So, okay, that's an achievement. Under questioning, he later reduced it to 12, and under investigation, it was finally reduced to 1. Namely, one person had sent about $8,000 to Somalia to an allegedly terrorist group. That's the total yield so far in security of these huge, massive surveillance programs that have been revealed, which is not so unusual. The claims of security begin to erode pretty quickly when one investigates them. Now, it is a major thesis of the theory of international relations that governments seek to safeguard security. And that sounds plausible on the surface, and maybe it is, but it's a little unclear. You have to first ask whose security are they committed to. Let's say, whose security are governments committed to maintain and safeguard? One possibility is that they're committed to the security of the state from public scrutiny. And that's actually quite true. Actually, the secrecy associated with the NSA surveillance is an example, and there are reasons for it, sometimes recognized clearly. So the professor of the science of government at Harvard University, distinguished political scientist Samuel Huntington, once pointed out, quoting, that the architects of power in the United States must create a force that can be felt but not seen. Power remains strong when it remains in the dark, exposed to sunlight, it begins to evaporate. That's a good point for those of you who are going to go into the diplomatic service or the government. That's well to remember. Power is going to evaporate if it's exposed to the sunlight, the way Edward Snowden exposed these operations to the sunlight. The NSA secrecy is a good illustration of Professor Huntington's insightful observation. Another possibility, apart from securing state power from the population, another kind of security that's significant is security of domestic power centers. In the West, that means the corporate sector primarily. Their security is quite important, and that has to be secured from inquiry and investigation by the public. There are many examples of that. So, just to take right now, there are two huge trade treaties under negotiation right now: the Transatlantic Trade Treaty, Trans-Pacific Partnership, another trade treaty. They're enormous in scope. They are being conducted in secret, as the trade agreements typically are, although of course not complete secret. They're not secret from the hundreds of corporate lawyers and lobbyists who are writing the detailed provisions of the treaty. They know all about them. And that suggests a very likely outcome. To the limited extent that we know anything about it, the expectations are confirmed, as you may have seen. WikiLeaks a little while ago released some documents, some material from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was the section on what's called intellectual property. Intellectual property refers to a device to extort from the public massive funds to increase the huge profits of corporations. So intellectual property means patent restrictions of an absolutely unprecedented kind. If they had existed in the past, England, the United States, and other countries would have never developed because they were involved in what's now called robbery when others do it. Huge, very high patent restrictions, particularly for industries like the pharmaceutical industry, which makes huge profits, thanks primarily to the monopoly pricing power that it's granted by these so-called free trade treaties. Of course, the pharmaceutical industry claims that they need those huge profits for research and development for your own benefit. They're always working for the benefit of the public, of course. The profits are just incidental. But there have been a few analyses by good economists of this, Baker in particular, who pointed out what everyone where I am kind of knows, because we can see the buildings of artists and others going up around us. A large part of their research and development is done in the public sector, places like where I am, MIT. That's why they're surrounded with this, rip off what they can from public sector research. That's a very substantial part. In fact, as Baker pointed out, if the R&D done in the public sector was increased to 100%, as it could be, of course, and the pharmaceutical corporations were compelled to sell their products on the market, there would be a huge saving to consumers, but of course a reduction of profits. So therefore that can't be contemplated. That's the part that was leaked. And none of this should be of any surprise. That's exactly the outcome you predict when agreements are crafted in secret by the corporate lobbyists, corporate lawyers, and the governments that secure their interests. In fact, if you look, these are not trade treaties at all. They're certainly not free trade treaties, as they're called, and very extensive protectionist elements like the ones I mentioned. And a large part of it doesn't even have to do with trade. These are really investor rights agreements. The public is an irrelevance, and as Samuel Huntington says, they have to be kept in the dark. That's why these negotiations are invariably in secret. Well, that's two kinds of security. Security of the state from its own citizens, and security of powerful domestic forces within the state from scrutiny by the general society. Now, there's a third kind of security, the security of the population. That's what's called the national interest or something like that, defense of the common interest. And so the question is that a high priority for governments? Well, I could happily run through lots of examples, starting with the defense, alleged defense from terror, and going on even to defense of the population from instant destruction. The record is quite significant. If you are not familiar with it, I'd urge you to look into it. And I think it shows quite definitively that security of the population is not a high concern for governments. They regularly and consistently act in ways which knowingly will endanger the public, but which will enhance state power and enhance the power of the domestic constituencies that matter, those in which power is concentrated. That's an important topic. There's no time to go through it here, but I think the conclusion is that as far as security is concerned, security of the general population is not a high priority. It's often willingly sacrificed. The security of the state from scrutiny from the public is a very high priority for the reasons that Professor Huntington mentioned, and security of powerful domestic sectors, corporate sector, particularly in the West. Yes, that's an extremely high priority. We see it in the current investor rights negotiations that are going on, mislabeled as free trade agreements, and in many other respects. Well, let's go back to where you are, to Glasgow. I confess that I'm not sure what the duties of a rector are, but there's no doubt that British universities face quite serious problems. You may have seen a series of articles in the London Review of Books by Stephen Collini running through the programs of the Cameron government with regard to the universities. These are extensions of what's been happening since Thatcher, since the neoliberal assault on the population really took off. His general conclusion, which I think is quite well argued, is that the government is dedicated to turning first-rate universities into third-rate commercial enterprises. I think that's pretty much true. Something similar is true in the United States, though it's not as extreme. There are some similar things on the continent in this period of what we should call neoliberal assault. And to protect the integrity of educational institutions in this neoliberal era is not going to be a small task. And I understand that there are local issues in Glasgow as well, and particularly issues of guarantees of fair employment conditions for the more vulnerable workers in the institution, faculty, staff, and others. I'm sure you know a lot more about these matters than I do, and I understand that information is being distributed in the auditorium. Well, just to conclude, we can only hope that the actions that you've been undertaking, combined with those of many others around the world, will permit Edward Snowden to undertake the responsibilities of the rectorship of the university and to live his life with the freedom and the acclaim that he quite certainly deserves. else just walked in and told me I'm dragging me out of here.